So it appears that the objective, subjective, never-ending, ongoing debate is still going strong, and I think it really needs to come to a crossroads or something. I don't know, because no one's conceding anything on either side. I haven't seen a single person budge at all, and I think if someone's going to have to budge, it's probably going to have to be, well, I mean, I've budged. I've had tons of debates in the comment sections, and I've placated their premise that everything that's a value judgment is based on a subjective preference. So I've, just for the sake of the argument, I've conceded that point, and I've argued from there on, and I think it can be done. And it's really funny how little consistency they apply to this particular argument, and how little they connect the rigorous scrutiny that they apply to this particular argument, that if there is suffering, and if the only way to reduce suffering, or to completely take it out of the equation and maximize productivity by doing so, if the only way to do that is to grandfather ourselves out of existence, that would be a subjective preference, according to them. So, everything else that's a subjective preference does not need to be scrutinized, that they believe in. Just this one fucking argument. No problem. Chances are, if you're watching this, you are, you're somebody who realizes that, you know, skinning human beings alive and not skinning human beings alive, the decision whether or not to do that, if you can, is different. It's made out of something more than a preference for either peanut butter jelly sandwiches or Nutella sandwiches. There's something a little more real that goes into making that decision, if you have the chance to do that. Chances are, if you're watching me, because I usually get the comments in support of that. So, if you're watching this, and if you're someone who tends to have debates with moral relativists at any point during either the comment sections or if you make videos about it, I say concede their premise that everything is based on every value judgment is based on a subjective preference. Placate that just for the sake of the argument, and apply something that I'm going to call Operation Consistency. Okay? Because what that basically is telling them that since they're applying this rigorous, pretty much insane principle to this particular argument, as to whether or not there is a real ethical choice to be made here, as to whether suffering should be eliminated, as to whether that's something that can increase productivity by us being grandfathered out of existence, apply their scrutiny of that position as a position that's made out of nothing but a subjective preference, and apply it to all the other conclusions they've drawn in their daily lives that they don't even know, I would like to think, because I mean, just so much of it is just built into us. So much of it is, so much of our behavior has been built into us through our evolutionary evolution, that we don't even consider how much of it is based on value judgment and how much of it we treat as an objective truth that we never even consider calling something that's just a ridiculous preference. So someone like Jeffrey Dahmer, someone like Charles Manson, if they really believe that those guys were thrown in prison because they, based on a subjective preference of theirs, decided to take the lives of others, and you know, the rest of us who created a law against that because we said, hey, you know what, life is something that shouldn't really be taken unless you want to take it yourself, unless the person living wants to do it themselves, but nobody else has the right to take somebody else's life. We made a law based on that, and that law was drawn from a conclusion. That law was passed based on a conclusion majority of people drew that was set in stone. Now, even though it was set in stone, according to these people, it's still not an objective because it's still based on a value that life has grace, decency, something that shouldn't be toyed with just so someone else can feed themselves. So basically, if these people think that it is something that's just a trivial little preference, I'm going to have to keep saying, then they should apply it and rally to free every single human being who was ever incarcerated based on a subjective preference stemming from a value judgment. But they don't do that. Number one reason why they don't do that is because they agree. Even though they call it a subjective thing, they agree. But even if they can agree with it, that these were horrible human beings that did this, if they derive that conclusion based off something that's as trivial as is equally trivial to a food preference, well, why does it matter at all? I mean, we're toying with people's lives based on a preference that's not made out of anything but a little beastie. I mean, if the intelligence cannot take things in and arrive at some sort of an enlightenment or an epiphany based on value judgment that's disconnected from the subjective beast, if that is impossible to be done, I mean, think of all the people that have been affected by this and who've had their lives ended based on preference. I mean, the legal system, mostly based on preference, a value judgment. So much of our everyday lives, everything we do just casually, but we know is not, well, I mean, they don't know, but they know deep down, is unquestionably the right thing to do, is never scrutinized by anyone. Never. I've never seen a single relativist condemn a court for, throwing Charles Manson in prison based on value judgment. Why is that? Why only this particular argument that we're making? Okay, why don't they go out fighting actual laws that are being passed? I don't get it. Well, I know I get it because because they don't want to because they want to take the legs out of this argument before the argument can even have a chance to develop, because if the argument is given a chance to develop, then the rationality of it will become inescapable. And the rationality of it is basically that the naturally imposed desire doesn't need to exist at the cost of suffering. And if we are gonna, do the progress argument, well, still we've had plenty of time to progress, but it's progressing with a cost. And at the stage we're at right now, it looks like that cost is going to be a little too fucking expensive, especially since we're rolling dice with the word progress. We don't know what the fuck the word progress is going to bring. So call it a value judgment. Call it a subjective preference. But treat it, despite of it being a subjective preference, treat it as a fucking argument. Just the way you would an argument against Charles Manson going around killing people. That's still a subjective preference. So have the fucking argument. Don't talk about the objective, subjective crap. All that does is drown out the actual fucking argument. Because I think it can be made either way. So that's all. I mean, we draw conclusions based on subjective values all the time. This specific issue should not be the exception. The issue of should suffering be reduced at the expense of naturally imposed desire coming to an end should not be taken off the table just because some asshole says subjective, I don't agree.